Yeah, just let me thank them first for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be here. As some of you perhaps know, this sort of theme of transimperial history is something I started working a couple of years ago, and so this is what I present today is also sort of an attempt to bring up some of the ideas I was thinking about during the last years, and I'm basically building on a sort of article that Daniel and I published a couple of years ago, where we had sort of a team of 3 C's and tried to sort of go beyond this a little bit and come up with some statements on also materiality. So that was more or less the idea. So is it on or? Okay. So I should just, yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so this is actually what we talked about, these 3 C's. So it was connectivity, cooperation, and competition. And what we tried to sort of say in this article, but also then in the conference we organized, is that we should not analytically isolate cooperation or competition, but sort of think them together and shed light on how they reinforce each other and how connectivity sort of plays in within this constellation. And our goal actually was not to detect or localize transimperial connections or cooperations by all means, but also include disconnections and rather use the transimperial approach as a point of departure for opening up new scales, both in terms of space and time, to sort of rethink imperial histories. So we proposed in this article to understand transimperialism less as an end than as a means to rewrite the histories of empires. And what I sort of wrote in my short piece was something that builds on this, but also includes building on, let's say, recent environmental history and scholarship on verticality, bringing in the sort of aspect of vertical and horizontal expansionism into the picture. And from this sort of point of departure, I also added a couple of thoughts on conditionality, communality, and commensurability within empire studies. But they were very loose, and I think it's just an entry point to also rethink and start thinking about these issues over the conference. And perhaps just to my background, the example I used to sort of elaborate on a couple of points I made is out of, or related to the book I'm currently writing, which is on tuna, and tuna sort of using as a lens to look into this horizontal and vertical expansion and history of empires. And it's at the sort of intersection of environmental history, empire studies, and history of knowledge, where my work can be seen. So just jumping into this example a little, for those that are not familiar with all these terms of territorialization of the ocean, what actually do I mean with this? It's this whole process that, from my point of view, starts before 1945, but eventually starts in the 1950s on an international level to remap the world and sort of integrate oceanic sort of territory, as it is named, even though one could, of course, then debate whether this is territory, but sort of include this into nation states. And it's deeply connected to this whole process of decolonization, rebuilding of nation states, but also, as I argue, to the afterlife of empires, and has this sort of trajectories to empires even before 1950s. And what also, in a way, Louis Young was mentioning in the keynote, so we have this sort of transfer history pre-1945 and post-1945, you can see. And then, as I'm originally also sort of out of history of Japan studies, I look in particular into the Japanese empire in this process, but also how it intersects and intermerges with other empires on the spot. And by so doing, I, in a way, write against, let's say, the historiography of international history or legal history, who usually would see starting this process with the establishment of the International Law of the Sea, which was enacted in 1982. And I would say we have to look back into this sort of empire background. And as you perhaps did read, this also then would sort of lead to a new chronology when we talk about deterritorialization or reterritorialization of the whole sort of 20th century. And I think one of the sort of most cited concept in this regard is Charles Meyer's idea of territoriality. And I would say when we look at this from a vertical point of view, and in particular from an oceanic point of view, his concept would have to be rewritten. And I think, I mean, I won't repeat all these theories now in this 10 minutes, so if you're interested, you can just get back to the paper, or perhaps you also did read and are already familiar with it. Anyway, so what I then sort of think is important when we talk about these legacies or afterlives of empire and how it connects in a transimperial way with decolonization processes is the emergence of nation states, and we can see this in particularly well in the South Pacific. As you can see here, all these sort of island states, these coastal states, become immense, and they are becoming nation state and decolonized as such. And this is, of course, very much connected, one could even say, as a global conditionality, come back to this early questions when during the keynote. It is in a way a global conditionality also to sort of rewrite empire histories, as not only the South Pacific, but also among, I mean, the Pacific, when it comes to Latin America and the United States, there were huge fights over natural resources and this vertical dimension, I would say. And that's an ongoing process we could examine through this trans-imperial lens in particular well. There were a couple of other points, and one was just out of my research, my argument about trans-imperial actors. So the importance also to look into these processes from a, let's say, grassroots level. So these are fishes that sort of crossed the Japanese empire, but not only during the period of pre-1945, but they were also much involved in so-called development projects after the official end of the Japanese empire. So we also have this sort of continuity that we were already coming up, and this sort of shifts of third world developmentalism to maybe first world developmentalism and much more. So I think to sort of examine all these processes of territorialization and reterritorialization, it helps to take a trans-imperial lens. Because in this whole sort of region, there was this clashes between various empires. So it was obviously not only the Japanese empire, but you had American, you had also Russia expanding here. And this is also a pre-1945 and a post-1945 phenomenon. So it also helps to explain a lot of ongoing geopolitical conflicts in a way. And coming quickly to these other sort of three C's. So what do we gain in a way from a trans-imperial approach is this the broader question we perhaps addressed during this conference. And I was thinking about a couple of conditionalities, and certainly with my background in history of knowledge and history of science, one particularly outstanding sort of conditionality is that we have these paradigms when it comes to knowledge production. So there are certain paradigms that are shared in between empires and that produce trans-imperial knowledge. And it's also that certain empires share sort of this idea what is deemed to be useful knowledge for them. And on the other hand, then we have trans-imperial actors that sort of also have this opportunity to be part of this trans-imperial knowledge production. And there, one of the things is also that those actors do not have to be part of an empire, but they can also belong to a nation state. So I think this recent scholarship on Switzerland without sort of colonialism, without colonial colonies is a point we can consider here, or the research we can consider here. Then I mentioned some points under this realm of commonalities. And I think here we sort of really have this sort of patterns when it comes to hierarchization of knowledge, useful knowledge that is shared among empires. And also sort of what I mentioned, this useful knowledge thing and the opportunities. Lastly, a couple of thoughts on, or yeah, maybe just one thought looking to the time that is left, to this question of commensurability. I think a good entry point to study this would be to look into what I called transimperial hotspots, so that we sort of overcome this dichotomy of metropole empire, but also this intra-empire sort of approach that we take sort of certain empires as containers and granted, but rather than move to frontiers, borderlands, or then also particular cities, or to end on Switzerland as a hotspot of transimperial entanglements. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Would you like to be here? Would you like to?
No, it's okay.
Whatever you want.
Yeah.
Well, it is my pleasure to introduce you, VÉRONIQUE from the Université Libre in Bruxelles, who will talk to us about a talk called From Colonial to Post-Colonial Comparisons. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. It's so great to be here after years of confinement. So it's great also to be here because I've just been invited to comment and debate on a book which is called The Empire Who Does Not Want to Die. I recommend you to read it. 600 pages on the France-Afrique networks. And it's been published by CYRUS, which is a French organization dedicated to the struggle against French neocolonialism in Africa. And one of the arguments of this book is that the France-Afrique is exceptionally French. You don't have any equivalence in Britain, of course. Britain has been dealing much more easily with its former colonial empire. And of course, it drew from, it's been deriving from a French colonial policy, among them, of course, the assimilation policy, the so-called assimilation policy, which was implemented especially after the Second World War. Now, my book, The Gouvernement des Colonies, which I published in 2004, was quoted in different places in this book. And when I went to this conference, this debate, one of the members of CYRUS came to me and said, "Your book was so inspiring. It shows how much assimilation was part of the Republican culture and how much it was part of the French colonial governance," which is, actually, I didn't dare to say anything. I tell him that, okay, maybe it was a misunderstanding. So as you will see, my book shows everything but that, for those who know well, anyway. But the remarks of this person show how much the idea of the French being by their culture, Republican culture, assimilationist by comparison to Britain, which are more with indirect governance in their colonies, how these ideas is persistent. It is persistent in a number of recent current debates, migration, development, neo-colonial policy towards Africa, and in the mindset of a certain number of actors, whether academics, especially those who are working with comparison and post-colonial comparison, politicians in Africa as well as in Europe, fonctionnaires, I'll come back to this in a minute, and it's also more recently been used very widely by activists to denounce the French policy in Africa. Now, to avoid any much more misunderstanding about my book, I will do a brief summary of the argument of that book, which is a book about colonial comparison and the use of this colonial comparison politically during the 30s, basically. And then I will come to the idea of this, how this comparison persisted over time after decolonization, well after the context in which they were produced and used disappeared. Now, concerning my book, the idea that the French Republican applied assimilation in their colony against the UK applying indirect rule was largely held by various actors from the end of the 19th century, even during the 19th century, at the national level, whether in the UK or in France, to justify or disqualify one policy over the others. Now, by assimilation, it usually means the imposition of culture, but it's very vague. And even in the book I've just mentioned, The Empire Who Doesn't Want to Die, the idea of assimilation is very vaguely defined. It can be cultural assimilation, political assimilation, administrative assimilation. It's very not clear, usually. Indirect rule also is sometimes not clear, but most of the time it's considered as the respect of native culture and political system and as a way to govern the natives. I show now in my book how this comparison became internationalized during the interwar period and how they became scientific in the 30s in France and Britain and how they led to some kind of controversy, scientific controversy between specialists of colonial administration in France and Britain. Marjorie Perham in the UK, which was an academic who trained colonial officials in Oxford, de La Vignette, Henri Labouret, who were academics, professor at the Colonial School, which trained a colonial official in France. Now, while participating in training of colonial officials, while participating in a certain number of networks around the League of Nations, the Permanent Mandate Commission especially, these specialists in colonial administration tried to develop a science of colonial government, which was comparative and inductive. It was comparative insofar it has to compare the different empires, and especially France and Britain, and to learn from the experience of other colonial governments with the idea of improving the government of natives, kind of best practice as we would call it today. And it was inductive. You have to go on the field to gather materials and draw some conclusion. And the field is always the same. It's the Cameroon, which was a mandate at that time, given a split between the French and the British after the First World War. Now, even though these specialists go to the same field work, do the same field work on the same place, they come with totally different conclusions. For Marjorie Perham, the French system was very different from the British. It was destroying the local chief, destroying the local culture, applying the French laws over native custom, etc., etc. And of course, the British system was based on respect for local customs and chief. And she used, in fact, a very deductive approach. She used the idea of cultural determinism to explain this difference. This idea, which has been becoming very popular afterwards, is like the Republican culture led to assimilation. In the same way, the aristocratic culture in Britain led to respect of chiefs, local aristocracy, and so on. Now, for the French, Henri Labouret, who went also to Cameroon, he saw no difference. He went to the same place and he saw no difference between the way the French and the British were governing their colony. They both applied indirect rule, according to him. And he used exactly the same cultural determinism. For him, French republicanism was not based on cultural universalism. It was based on the respect of native French terroir in France and the native culture in the colonies. Now, in my book, I'm not trying to say who is right and who is wrong. That's why I say that the French Republican were assimilationists. That's not what I say at all. I try to explain rather why these comparisons were made, by whom, and in which historical context. And the historical context is a context of competition between France and Britain, in the context also of the internationalization of the colonial question through the Permanent Mandate Commission. It was a kind of battle of legitimation. Each country tried to show to the world that they were respecting some international norms, and the international norms in terms of good colonial government at that time, which was produced by the Mandate Commission's representatives, was indirect rule. And indirect rule at that time was considered as the best way to reach the Article 22 of the Covenant to ensure the government or the welfare of these people who are not yet able to stand by themselves. So indirect rule was considered as very liberal and even democratic, which is not, definitely not. If you look at the work of Mantegna, who's been working on the indirect rule during the British India and the turn between direct and indirect rule in India, you show very clearly that indirect rule is very conservative. And interestingly here, assimilation was seen by the British and the French also, like Henri Labouré, as very conservative, very authoritarian, because you destroy the culture, you destroy the local elite, and so on and so on. Well, in fact, if you look at Mantegna's book again, the idea of direct rule, the idea of transferring the representative democracy to the colonies, in British India in that case, was very liberal. So basically, and this was the context, and the context also in the mid-30s was the German who wanted to claim back their mandates, wanted to have back their mandates. And of course, the very big question for French and British government was to know which one would sacrifice his own mandate, British or French part of the Cameroon, to the German ambition. Of course, the British said, take the French part, they don't know how to govern according to the mandate principle of indirect rule. And of course, the French, on the other hand, would use scientific evidence, Henri Labouré's evidence, to show that they were doing indirect rule in conformity with the League of Nations Mandate Commission's principle. Now, what is interesting at this controversy resurfaced well after decolonization in 1964 between two historians. One, Michael Crowder, was working in Nigeria at the time, and Hubert Deschamps, which was a former student at the Colonial School. But this controversy was short-lived. Very quickly, only the British version prevailed, even within the work of French historians, which were few at that time, who worked on the colonial time, like Jean-Louis Miège, for example. So only the British version survived, and we forgot about the other part of the controversy, the French version. And with decolonization, this comparison took a new dimension. In the work of many historians, French as British, the idea was that the British decolonization had been more successful. How you measure that, I don't know, but it's been more successful than the French, because basically since the British had better colonized, they'd better prepare for decolonization, and they better decolonize. That was, the ideas. And so we see, I'm answering your question, CYRUS, the battle of legitimacy went on after decolonization, and I'm coming back to it in a minute. Now, I just finished by this. There are three hypotheses why this French version prevailed. I don't know which hypothesis is right. I'm still working on these. Now, first hypothesis, those who made this comparison, either in the 30s or in the 50s, like Marjorie Perham, and in the 80s, even Anthony Kerr-Green was my supervisor, an historian who worked in Nigeria and who took over who repeated the same kind of comparison. Those were teaching at very prestigious university, and they were part of the academic world. So one of the hypotheses is their version had more legitimacy than the one who were conveyed by the French historian, who were only working from the perspective of the colonial school, and the colonial school, of course, stopped, was closed after decolonization. So their findings, if you want, just disappear as they themselves disappear to some extent. So that's one of the hypotheses. The second hypothesis is the trauma of Algeria and the internationalization of the Algerian debate. And the idea is this helped the British version to prevail because it reinforced the idea that the so-called assimilation policy applied in Algeria could only lead to a bad decolonization process. Now, the problem is that, as far as I know, there's never been any political assimilation in Algeria. That was the war broke out at the first place because there was no political assimilation of the natives Muslim. Now, by contrast, the propaganda of the British government, the way it succeeded in hiding some realities, like for example, the concentration camp in Kenya, that's been really well examined by Elkins recently. All these help to reinforce the idea that the British had better colonize, of course, through indirect rule, and decolonize. And here again, it's very ironic because the Momo uprising was the direct result of indirect rule. So, but now, what we can conclude about this is the competition between colonial power to justify their work went on well after decolonization, but maybe also it went after decolonization because decolonization was not really over. If we think that development policy, and I've been working since 20 years on development policy and the way you replicate some kind of colonial mindset, we may think that maybe decolonization was not so over. And as far as I'm concerned, I've been publishing on these more recently. In the 1960s, 70s, you have the same comparison which appear among the network of civil servants, for example, in the UK, working for the Overseas Development Administration. And in their battle within the EC European Development Policy, they systematically use this kind of comparison to dismiss the French way of dealing with their former colony, the French development policy. And as the EC development policy, the European development policy was modeled on the French development policy, they use that argument to systematically devalorize the way the European development policy worked, and trying, of course, to force some change on the European Development Fund, for example. And my third hypothesis, and I will end up by these, is that the British version of this comparison were used, won over in the end, because they were used by a certain number of actors, and are still used today, in France itself, within the national debate. Not so much at the international debate level, but at the national level, and especially to justify some policy concerning migration, for example. And I will finish by these. I think here of a debate which happened around the 2014, 2015, 16, before the presidential election in France. And at this time, the extreme right, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, so the extreme right, racist extreme right, defend the idea of assimilation. It was very, very funny, not funny, but they defend the idea of assimilation, saying that it was the best way to fight against racism in the French societies. Because if the migrants were, how do you say that, were amalgamated into the French society, then they would disappear as migrants, and the problem was solved. And for those who didn't want to amalgamate, get out. So that was the argument of Marion Maréchal Le Pen, and she used a counterexample of the Anglo-Saxon way of dealing with migrants, which is more respectful of cultural differences, of community, etc., etc. Very interesting. And as an answer, Juppé, at that time, was more from the center-right, considered the assimilation policy as a very old colonial stuff, out of fashion. We should get rid of it, and used the Anglo-Saxon model to deal with the immigration policy. So you see how these comparisons were used again in purely national context, and they're still used because some of the people of Survie are still using it to dismiss systematically the French way of dealing with their former colony. So be careful when you use that kind of comparison, and please don't say what I didn't say. That's the worst for another. No, but it's not the first time. My students, usually when I ask that kind of question, I can see if they've been reading the book or not. According to this answer, because so much in the mind that people say, okay, the answer is obvious, basically. So that's it. I finished.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to sit? Do you want to stand? What do you want? Yeah. Whatever you want. Yeah. Okay. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Paul KRAMER from Vanderbilt University. And his paper is entitled The Prospects of Inter-Imperial History, the Case of the Modern United States in the World.
Thank you, Cyrus. So it's wonderful to be here, and yeah, like other people, I'd like to thank David and Cyrus for the opportunity and for making all the arrangements. And it's also just want to thank you all for your wonderful presentations, uploading online. Just the encounter with your thinking on these themes was just really energizing. And as Véronique was saying, after this long period of confinement, just being together with you all and having this chance for intellectual camaraderie is just really wonderful. So my comments are going to be kind of conceptual, and my posting to the presentation was a long list of kind of questions and provocations and just things that we are thinking about already in this field of inter-imperial and transimperial history, and some things we might want to be thinking about. And rather than try to go through all of those in a short amount of time, I'm just going to pull out a couple of themes to focus on, and they all really center back on this question that the wonderful keynote by Louise brought up, which was this question about a nation and empire and their relationship to each other. So the 3 points I want to raise are about the relationships between the inter-imperial and the international. And of course, that involves the question of the relationship between nation and empire and how we conceptualize those. The second one is about the role of technocratic politics and power in inter-imperial and transimperial history. And the third is about the role of the United States in inter-imperial history, which is something that I've been working on. So first, the question of the relationship between inter-imperial and the international. One of the things I find really remarkable in this field, reading around and including in many of the papers that that were posted, is about how many agencies, institutions, projects, and personnel that we associate with internationalism and its agencies, particularly in the post-World War II period, come explicitly, self-consciously, unapologetically out of an inter-imperial milieu in the early 20th century. And yet, by the post-war period, with the rise of anti-colonial revolt, colonial repression, and decolonization, these linkages are made to fade into the background. And so in some cases, they appear to have been institutionally or individually repressed in terms of the career and development of international institutions. So for example, if I think about the powerful and influential field of post-war international relations in the United States, by the height of the Cold War, these experts, many of whom had high-level positions in the national security state, would have identified the canonical genealogy of their field as tracing back to ancient Greece, for example. But in fact, only 2 or 3 decades earlier, the field itself had defined itself in terms of the scientific politics of colonial rule. Before it took on its post-war name, Foreign Relations, for example, a leading journal in international relations, had been called the Journal of Race Development. And its pages had been filled with technocratic understandings of the best ways to pursue colonial domination. So the question then is how, when, where, and to what degree did the international, as we conceive of it, break away discursively and politically from the inter-imperial? And what implications does that have for the writing of history, including international history? Now, speculatively, a few factors I think are at work in this process. Obviously, there's decolonization's delegitimation of colonial empire, defined as alien rule and racialized differential sovereignties. We also, of course, have the rise of the UN regime with its aspirational universalization of the nation-state form through its structures of government and its normative framework. And in particular, I think we have the ideological and geopolitical rise of the United States, a country whose defining ideologies have been predicated on the dichotomizing of nation and empire. And we see this splitting happening between nation and empire, between inter-imperial and international, happening on lots of different domains of social thought. We see the dichotomizing of nation and empire as logics and structures of political rule, often with an explicit contrast in the ways that they deal with difference. Empires as hierarchical but inclusionary, nations as putatively horizontal but exclusionary and zero-sum in their difference politics, etc. We also see the sequencing in terms of historiographic narratives, the idea of a world historic shift from empires to nation states, for example. Now, in some of the work I've done in terms of trying to break us out of some of these dichotomies, I've suggested a variety of different historical articulations of nation and empire that might be conceptually useful in terms of getting us beyond this rigid dichotomy. Thinking about imperial nations, that is, national polities defined in terms of their relationships to the pursuit of dominating power vis-a-vis their quote-unquote outsides. Multinational empires, imperial polities that conceive of themselves as containing multiple national communities. We have nation-building empires, empires that conceive of themselves as building national communities on their outside, particularly ones amenable to clientelistic relationships. And finally, we can even have something we might call the empire of nation states or international empire, that is, empires that consist of multiple sovereign nation states in which global governance is sort of taking place in the regulation and the kind of networking between ostensibly sovereign nation states. So in brief, we need to be asking ourselves, I think, what our investments are in the distinction between empire states and nation states, and what they include, particularly for the post-1945 period. And to put it perhaps somewhat more sharply, is international history as a project just inter-imperial history that's uneasy with that designation? Okay, the second point I want to make is about the intersections between inter-imperial encounters and technocratic power and politics. One of the things that struck me reading across the papers was the immense variety of explicitly scientized and academic disciplines that they involve. Geography, botany, agricultural science, and soil research, and demography, for example. And all of these end up circling with various degrees of proximity and intensity around the question of biopolitics. And this left me wondering about the specific and defining importance of technocrats and technocratic modes of politics in inter-imperial encounters and exchanges. Now, this could partly be an artifact of the conference's overarching periodization in terms of the rise of self-consciously modernizing technocratic colonial systems. But I was also wondering if we might think about the particular role that expert governance, technocratic modes of seeing, and scientized ways of thinking about population, the social, ecology, exploitable resources, etc., might play a role. Might it be the case that technocratic modes of knowledge created potential legibilities and commensurabilities across and between nationalized colonial orders? In other words, could expert rule and technocracy have provided a kind of meta-language through which exchanges and dialogues and borrowings could occur? And of course, this also means that technocratic languages could structure their own kinds of mistranslations, misreadings, clashes, misunderstandings, tensions, and rivalries, etc., but happening within a shared and common idiom of scientized politics. So, for example, scientized politics could allow for the abstracting of colonial governance from one's own national history and traditions, the understanding of the laws of colonial governance, of productivity, of racialized developmentalism, etc. To what extent do denser, more intense, and more varied interactions between imperial systems help give rise to technocratic politics more broadly, alongside the building of metropolitan bureaucracies, modes of expert governance, the building of welfare regimes, etc.? I think it's also important to perhaps think about technocracy when we think about the politics of colonialism and anti-colonialism. In the face of charges, increasingly salient and persuasive charges, that colonialism was backward, neo-feudal, etc., technocracy was a way to convey the modernity of colonial rule and the superiority of colonial rulers on the basis of their scientific and technological sophistication, and also their disinterestedness. There was a way that the language, the idiom of science, took colonial rule outside of an ethical vocabulary about power and brought it into a kind of scientific vocabulary in which there were other metrics. Particularly, I think you can say that technocracy shifted debates about colonialism from questions of power and justice, including questions of racialized exploitation and violence, to questions of success, of effectiveness, of best practices, as Véronique was saying. And this, of course, goes on to shape, profoundly shape, the historiographic landscape in turn, right? That a huge amount of early and ongoing writing about empire is essentially operating in that technocratic mode of comparing empires not in terms of a kind of ethical assessment, but in terms of this technocratic vocabulary of success and effectiveness, which has its roots in the colonial period itself. Okay, just to finish up. Third and finally, the role of the United States in inter-imperial history. Now, on the one hand, the U.S. has a long and awkward relationship to imperial histories generally, including inter-imperial histories, for complex reasons and with massive ideological effects. Now, this is for a number of different reasons. It has to do with Republican anti-imperialism in Americans' founding political ideologies and self-identities. It has to do with the rise of liberal internationalism as a spatial and ideological regime in the 1940s and 50s. And of course, it has to do with Cold War ideological battles in which empire and its close cognates became terms of derision thrown at the Soviet Union and repelled from the United States, which cast an enormously long shadow. So basically, since around 1940, if you applied concepts of empire to the United States, you were suspected of no longer being an academic scholar, of being some kind of polemicist, at least by some historians. Now, important breaks began to happen during the Vietnam War. The Wisconsin School has already come up. There were additional breaks and openings in the 1990s and intensified in the early 2000s, corresponding with Louise's account of the imperial boom in Japan scholarships. In the US case, this was explicitly propelled by the US War on Terror, and not unimportantly, by the embrace of the language of empire by many American neoconservatives. So if empire had been a term of derision that made you out to be some kind of left ideologue, neoconservatives taking it back as a term of affirmation, in a way, opened up new kinds of analytic space, quite against the grain of their intentions. Now, from my perspective, as one of many scholars who've been engaged in these struggles, inter-imperial history has a particularly positive and beneficial role to play in de-exceptionalizing the study of American power in the world. That is, in insisting on applying the same conceptual and analytic vocabulary to the United States as for other world powers, despite the ways that its histories are distinctive, as all national and imperial histories are distinctive. And one way to encourage ourselves to do this as scholars is to historicize Americans' encounters and relationships with other imperial states and societies. Tracking some of these dynamics and exchanges, we can talk about the ways the U.S. Succeeded on other European colonial powers in North America and beyond. We can talk about forms of technocratic borrowing and exchange and comparison, rivalry, conflict, and warfare, as well as collaboration and cooperation. By approaching histories of the U.S. and the world through the lens of inter-imperial history, analytically foregrounding concepts that U.S. imperial nationalism have historically rejected, may be one of the keys to decolonizing U.S. history. And conversely, bringing the U.S. into the conversation about inter-imperial history might be important precisely because it makes us ask what empire is and isn't, and what's at stake in how we define and delimit it as a category. Okay, one quick final point I want to make is a question that about the relationship between concepts like the transimperial and inter-imperial, which is how did empire history become nationalized in the first place? In other words, one useful enterprise might be to ask ourselves about the kind of structuring preconditions that make a conference like this so important and necessary. How did the very terrain of the imperial come to be subdivided in such a way that it apparently requires suturing back together? Now, to be sure, there are very sound and legitimate reasons to approach empire through a nationalizing lens, but there are lots of ways of waging empire historically in the name of other principles: religion, race, civilization, the world capitalist economy, for example. When our historical actors engaged in what we're calling interactions and encounters across presumptive national boundaries, to what extent might they have been integral to larger processes which our own methodological nationalist lenses haven't allowed us to see up until now? In other words, at the heart of concepts like the transimperial and inter-imperial is a kind of surprise about these relationships and interconnectivities. And as we go forward, it might be fruitful to look into that surprise, where it comes from and what its implications are. Thanks.
Let me start with a question posed online by Shellen Wu, who is part of the conference, but unfortunately couldn't come. Shall I use the word over there? Yes, sorry. Let me do that. Okay. And she is asking all three of you, and for the sake of timekeeping, maybe one could volunteer to answer. For all three panelists, particularly Paul and Nadine,
your papers keep circling back to the issue of language, how we define empires and nation-state, evasive avoidance of certain terms and designations, the units of analysis, water versus land. Could the creation of technocratic languages also be a means of evasion, using the universalizing language of science to conceal differences? And I should add that I think she posed this language just before you, Paul, started to actually talk about technocracy. So, who would like to volunteer?
Well, perhaps I
You.
could, yeah, because she sort of addressed me in particular. Yeah, I think, right, it circles back to language questions, and certainly also to technocratic languages. But in a way, I think if we look at empires more broadly, I mean, certainly we now talk about the modern area, so-called modern area or period, there are also phenomena that wouldn't be sort of expressed in this, what we now name technocratic languages, right? And if you look at, let's say, the Columbian exchange and ecological empires, this wasn't primarily based on technocratic language, in a sense. And there would be, of course, a couple of other examples. And still we would have this sort of search for resources in multiple levels, for natural resources, but also others, human resources, for instance, but human, non-human species in a sort of very broad sense. So I'm not quite sure whether this is really a precondition to start, or if this is really the global conditionality that we sort of have this paradigm of technocratic language to talk about this.
Yeah. Thank you. Paul, do you want to maybe very quickly add something, and then we can move on?
Yeah, I guess I would just say, yeah, I mean, that certainly technocratic vocabularies have not informed the entire sort of landscape of imperial scholarship, and I think that's been a long, successful struggle to kind of break away from some of those canonical ways of understanding and writing. I mean, and yet it's still present. I mean, it's present very much in public debates about all of these empires, right? And I think that's something that, and it's a slippage that can happen in particularly at that kind of scholarly public intersection where instead of assessing, sort of making historical evaluations on the basis of questions of power and justice, historians can get kind of wrangled into arguing about best practices, success, right? Which colonial, quote, natives benefited most from colonialism, et cetera. And I think there is something about the importance of being suspicious of the fact that we are engaging in these set of inquiries in academic institutions with their own deep historical ties to colonialism and neocolonialism. And that's a lot of the kind of registers of authority within the academic universe can promote an emphasis on kind of technocratic ways of knowing. So that's something that I think is just worth a kind of ongoing suspicion, even as much of this literature has broken out of that mode.
Thank you. So we have, let me just say a couple of names that I just saw. I think, I didn't see exactly who went first, but let's say Michel, Harald, Martin, Ulrike, and Ben. Okay, let's do it in this, and then, yes. Daniel, sorry. Let's start with Michel, okay? And yeah, we have time.
We have time, okay, great.
Yes, yes.
I had a question.
I mean, let's be short, but
yeah, I'll try to be precise. It's actually 3 questions for Véronique. The first one is, why so much Cameroon? Right, and it's interesting because in the Cameroonian case specifically, the British-French division sort of partly maps on a religious division. So my question would be how this plays out in this contrast that analysts draw between British policy and French policy. Because you might as well look at, I don't know, Côte d'Ivoire versus Gold Coast, right? So I was interested in why there's so much focus on Cameroon. The second question would be, I associate this often with a book by Raymond Betts, who of course draws an intra-French distinction between assimilationist and so-called associationist policies, the first of which are often associated with the Popular Front, the second then with Vichy. But there the British comparison doesn't seem to be so important in his, drawing this this distinction, right? So I wonder how intra-French divides that you mentioned in passing play into the British-French comparison. And the third one is why British-French so much rather than anyone else, right? In some ways it's not surprising. There's always this British-French rivalry, competition, comparison, and so forth. But you might as well talk about other empires, some of which, you know, have an even more assimilationist, let's say, press than the French do, like the Portuguese, for instance. Does that ever come up in the discussion?
Okay, I can't answer all these questions. The second, we can talk about it. The first one is because the Cameroon was a mandate. And as I said, the whole controversy was around the mandate system and how French or British would apply the norms of a mandate system in their colony and specifically in their mandate. So, and the Cameroon was a very easy case because it was divided between the French and the British. One was part of Nigeria and the other one was part of France, French and West African Empire. Now, concerning, the last one is a very good question. I was expecting it because I didn't mention it, I didn't have time. It was part of the national building identity of France and Britain, and especially of the elite building this national identity all over the 19th century. So before working on colonialism, has been working on French and British caricature of each other during the Napoleonic War and before during the Revolution. And it's systematically, and the French were depicted as, in a bad sense, by the British elite because of the French Revolution, and of course because of Napoleon afterwards. So it was the wrong path to democracy, the French system. By contrast, the British system was the right path to slow democratization. So it was part of the national identity building in both countries, which drew back much before than the colonial time. I would say the end of the 18th century, when the French Revolution happened. Maybe before, I don't know, but it's definitely from that. So these comparisons were part of a building of national identity, which was mainly constructed by a certain elite, a Republican elite on one hand, which sometimes, like Jules Ferry, referred to the British example as a very good example of democratization process, of colonization, whatever. On the other hand, on the British side, it was the French, the French model was much more criticized as being the bad model to follow in most of the time. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Can I just add one word?
Yeah.
So in some sense, I guess then, this is a really interesting shift from the British versus Spanish sort of early modern contrast, yeah. Right? Where the Spanish are the bad ones, they don't know what they're doing, or they're doing it badly and we're doing it rightly. It's an interesting shift. Okay, Marty, let's continue there. Harold.
My question has been answered.
Oh, okay. Really? Okay.
Hi, Martin Duesenberg from University of Zurich. I have a question probably more towards Paul, but the rest of you perhaps can answer it, which is, it's to do, Paul, with who the actors are behind all of the questions that you ask in your written paper. You began to answer that a little bit in part 2 when you talked about technocrats, but it seems to me there's a certain sort of, one might say, consistency or hegemony in the actors and therefore in the types of questions you're asking, because they're all focused on the people who have the power to make a decision about where the comparison is, right? About how to identify an imperial peer or non-peer, which is a terminology I like. It's about also, therefore, the people who have the power to study these empires, in other words, us, right? And I just wondered if we could imagine a different starting point for your questions with a different set of actors and therefore with a different set of sources, which would be people on the other side of the gun or the colonial company or the pen, indeed. And what would an inter-imperial history look like from what we might sort of very broadly call this indigenous starting point and these indigenous actors?
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, and your paper, I think really gives us one model for what this might look like, and it's a fantastic model. I mean, I think what I was trying to do in a way was to kind of identify the current patterns. The current patterns in the historiography, which have emphasized, I think, this managerial expert level, and in a way that it makes sense in terms of how we conceive of empire, in part the legacies of the kind of official mind scholarship, and also in terms of where the sources are, that has been maybe an early layer of this inter-imperial history. But in terms of one of the directions that I would really like to see it go would really be towards these kind of subaltern inter-imperial histories. Looking at labor migration, right? Looking at the intersections of labor migration and settler colonialism of the kind that you're tracking in your paper, looking at anti-colonial resistance and the kinds of interactions between and across imperial systems. My hope is that kind of what I see is that emphasis on a kind of technocratic managerial layer, which is the artifact of all of these accumulated questions of sources, of how we conceive of empire as top-down statist kind of power, that's a first step, and that eventually what that helps do is remap our kind of meta-geographies in ways that we then methodologically apply the tools of subaltern history, social history, labor history, and I think we're already seeing that. I mean, we're seeing lots of attention emerging at kind of the intersection of labor history and empire history, for example. And so it feels like that's a direction that things are already going. And I think that's a really exciting development.
Yeah, Ulrike.
Thank you very much. My name is Ulrike Lindner. I'm from Cologne. I have a question to Véronique. I'm wondering about the role of Lord Lugard in this whole setup, because Marjorie Parham really hailed him, and he was the author of the dual mandate, so of the book about indirect rule, and he sat in every commission in the 20s, in the Mandate Commission, in the ILO, everywhere. So he was very influential in the post-World War I period. So what was his role in making this British sort of colonization so attractive? That's my first question. And the second is, the British Empire is so dominant in research and also worldwide, so maybe this is also a reason why this British, this comparison is still going on. Because if you study empire studies in Germany, you read the British stuff, you read the German stuff, but you don't read the French, because most people can't, and so on. And so it's a problem, yeah. But that's more a remark. And the other thing is about, to Paul KRAMER, and I was wondering, if you say international history comes out of inter-imperial history, what I found in my research, there are very different narratives concerning the time period before World War I. Because in international history, you have a lot of competition and leading to the First World War, but in inter-imperial history, you have a lot more cooperation. So you have a very different meta-narrative in this time. So how does this fit into your argument? And the other thing is, because Florian Wagner is not here now, there was a forerunner to this technocratic things. It was the Institut Colonial International. I've worked a little bit on it. It was founded in Brussels in 1894, and Florian Wagner has written a big book on it. It has just been published, and it's exactly on scientific governance, and it was French, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, also British people coming together and doing things what they later did in the same commissions in the 20s, in the 40s, in the 50s. So it's a forerunner to all of this. So this might be interesting for you. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to answer? And I will answer to your question about Raymond Betts. I think you're right and not totally right, because many historians in France just took this comparison also. They reintegrate this comparison without contesting them. And one had to wait for Raymond Betts to begin to cast doubts about this kind of comparison by saying, okay, you know, since a long time ago, the French moved from the assimilation to the association policy. And then Raoul Girardet took over and some other people. And Raymond Betts wrote it in French. He was from Grenoble. He wrote in his PhD in Grenoble, but he translated it in English. So basically, and despite this, the comparison went on. So at first, now he is very well read, but for years people just ignore his work. Now concerning the Lugards, the relation with Marjorie Perham, well, Marjorie Perham was fascinated by the indirect rule stuff. That's it. Whether it come from Lugard or not from Lugard, she was an indirect rule defender. It's only in the 40s, late 40s, she began to turn, you know, and say that maybe you have to evolve. And concerning Lugard, I show in my book, so a long time ago, how he became to dominate the debate in the Mandate Commission and impose his own version of the good government for the mandate system. And he systematically, in the mandate debates and discussion, he systematically try on other British using reports of the British and the French, systematically tried to dismiss the French way of doing, saying they were not doing good indirect rule and so on and so on. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but
Thank you for your question. This question of the genealogies of internationalism, I think is a really important one, and I think it's, you know, my sense is that if we think about where the architects of 20th century internationalism kind of draw their genealogy, that they're looking to kind of histories of intra-European civil society emerging, or longer histories of Enlightenment cosmopolitanism, and that's the kind of, the sense of like what you're building in the post-1945 period is the globalization of these Enlightenment ideologies of cosmopolitan coexistence, but now extended onto a truly global canvas for the first time, right? Or, and what I find striking is that the personnel that are, in many cases, inhabiting those institutions, you know, are actually part of this inter-imperial trajectory, right? And that, I think, is really interesting, and just in terms of what happens to that history. Like, can it be recognized? Can it be admitted? Is it something that you use to kind of, you know, get a job at the United Nations, you know, or in international agencies? Or is it the kind of thing that, because of the delegitimization of overt racism, of kind of asymmetrical sovereignty, you know, is that the kind of thing where you have to look back to these other trajectories, however illusory they are in terms of their actual foundational influence? But that's something I'm interested in learning more about.
Okay, thank you. We have 20 more minutes, so I think we have about 5 or 6 questions left. So let's be brief and please ask one question and have a short answer. Let's start with Ben, and then I'll sort of make my way around. Okay, Ben.
So mine was quite short. I was wondering whether the question of the inclusion of the United States into the categorization imperialism being late was more a matter of the lateness of academics in general and American academics in particular, because you could go back to a film like Dusan Makavayev's WR, Mysteries of the Organism, which is a kind of Cold War critique of both sides, their imperialism through the rubric of the psychoanalyst Marxist Wilhelm Reich. It's a very peculiar film. I think that's the best I can describe it as. But the critique of empire and of the United States' role in it, and of basically the new left coming into being, was, I think, much earlier than when mainstream academia took it up. And if I were to address it to Paul, I would ask whether your observation that it's late in American academia is an observation that it appears late as a kind of mainstream perspective, or whether it had already appeared before.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the question of how we talk about the timing and the periodization of these debates is really important, in part because embedded in them is a whole series of questions about who counts as a voice and as an actor and as a perceiver. And so, So I think one of the interesting things to kind of track is when is American power kind of critically visible to whom, at what stages, and there's the question of when is it critically visible to activist milieu, the anti-war milieu particularly. But I think, that really needs to be distinguished, I think, from the scholarly trajectory, in part because just it's basically a 50-year battle, ongoing battle to, which in some ways the Wisconsin school sort of advances, but which is also absorbed. I mean, there's some ways that the critical thrust of that scholarship gets reabsorbed into a kind of new diplomatic history in the 1980s, for example, and beyond, that requires a renewed critical attention to empire, particularly through its cultural, linguistic, gendered, and racial understandings beginning in the 1990s. And then the War on Terror, I think, really does represent a breakthrough in the sense that it becomes much harder to deny the salience of this category when the architects of American foreign policy are actually using that. So in an ironic way, the kind of battles that the New Left begins to legitimate this as a category of analysis are ones that neoconservatives end up realizing, I think, by at least temporarily kind of embracing this vocabulary. But I think, the question of when U.S. empire becomes visible as such, and then also what people do with the category. I guess one of the things that I'm struck with is we're now at a stage where I feel like the exceptionalist moment of saying the U.S. is a world power that was not an empire, was never, will never, it's categorically different. I feel like we're beyond that. I feel like that exceptionalist framework, which I tightly associate with the Cold War, does feel like it's behind us. But the question of how we define empire and what we use the category to do are very much in front of us. And here I think we see attempts to contain the critique by narrowly defining empire in terms of U.S. colonial rule, which I've written about, lots of other people have written about, and which is really important to the history, but also one that delimits empire, that would not sort of keep clientelistic relationships, would not keep asymmetric trade agreements, would not include the Washington Consensus and neoliberalism as part of empire. And I feel like that's actually the struggle we're in now, is it going to be the narrow definition of empire or the more expansive definition?
Can I just piggyback on this to say one thing very quickly? I mean, even territorially, right, the post-World War II US empire still actually works territorially. It's just that they don't occupy full countries anymore, with the exception, of course, of Germany and Japan, who used to be the two biggest competitors. So that's one huge, exception. And then, I mean, I do some work on Beirut, and in some ways you can think of a city and its local elite as a place, a very highly concentrated place, through which certain mechanisms of US international empire actually do work, right? And you can see this. So it's not the whole nation state anymore, but it's particular bits and places within one city, just to use another. And I think that's, I mean, to me, this is like, it was very interesting to think about it this way. Anyway, sorry. Ron, please.
Thank you. This is an amazing discussion, as is the whole conference, I must say. I'm learning so much. I feel like a superannuated graduate student, which is a good place to be. So I'm following what I heard from Paul, particularly that, and I'm wondering, is it valuable, is it helpful, or is it limiting and restricting if we do try to define empire, right? There's a thrust in the conference that says, don't bother. Don't concern yourself with ideal types of one kind or another. Let's see where we go, right? That is, but I'm still old-fashioned enough to remember when distinctions were made, let's say in Michael Doyle's work, about hegemony versus empire, whether empire controls both domestic and foreign policies of a state, real colonialism or whatever, and the kind of thing that you find in post-World War II United States. So I wouldn't want to restrict this discussion in any way, but coming from my own stance, which is contiguous state empires of Russia, the Ottomans, and so forth, it seems clearer what an empire is. Is it useful to open it up this way, or is it restricting in some ways the discussion?
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, no, I think, you know, I guess I'm in a mode where I feel like the conversation and Doyle's part, you know, doing this and lots of other scholars, the problem has been the imposition of these typologies, right? In a way, it goes back to the kind of assimilation, association, indirect rule, right? It's where imperial systems take on a kind of reified character, which is often linked to national character and become very ideologically charged, right? And also these kind of rigid typologies. And, you know, I'm all for looking at different modalities of empire, right? The different territorial regimes, the ways in which elite networks operate, as Cyrus was saying. You know, their spatialities, you know, how they imagine themselves as world powers. Like those are exactly the kinds of questions that I think we're already exploring and need to continue exploring. But I do think you know, if there's a way to approach these modalities of empire without typologies, right, that get us into these rigid categorical boxes, and which really inhibit a kind of open-ended inquiry, I think that's the way to go. Yeah, but I think, you know, making these distinctions is really important. And I think in a way the question for me is less what empire is than what we do with it analytically. Like what is its purpose? And I feel like what empire does is, you know, introduce a kind of a set of social categories that help us think about power and globality and about the intersections between the kind of insides and outsides of modern polities and their intersections. And it's also a way of thinking about, I mean, one of its functions, I think, is that it helps us think about these world powers in a way that does not neutralize their power, exploitation, and violence. I think there's actually an ethical and political dimension to the category of empire, which is an important part of why it needs to be a part of the discussion. But you're right, that's not about what empire is and isn't so much as what it does for us, right, as scholars and as human beings.
I think Daniel was next. Eileen, did you have your hand up as well? So let's start with you, and then Daniel, and then I think Christoph, you had your hand up too. Yes.
Oh no, Daniel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry for, I'm not used to this kind of very nice settings. I wanted to come back to some conceptual or some concepts you used here. I mean, it's a very German way to go, but some of you used the inter-imperial term, some are using more the transimperial. I just want to ask you, do you see any sense in make a differentiation between them, or are they interchangeable at the end of the day? And then we have comparison, and it's also written with a C, so we would have 4 C's. And when I remember right, Nadine and I discussed this, but then we went with connectivity, because this is much more pointing to the transfer side of the story, which then was connected to transnational and global history. And so I had always the impression that a transimperial approach to comparison would be just to historicize how empires were compared. But then I would ask you if you see it the same way, or is there still a way to bring in a comparative history of empires into this transimperial framework?
I'm happy to start off briefly. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I don't have a strong investment in one term or the other. I mean, I do feel like, as with international history versus transnational history, there are connotative differences that are kind of subtle. I mean, international history, I think, tends to be about the domain of interstate interaction, right? And it can be happening in the civil society sphere. It doesn't have to be happening within the state sphere. Whereas transnational history tends to be about, you know, self-consciously cosmopolitan actors who move in and between national polities and who sort of don't identify as strongly. I think there's some problems with that distinction. I mean, I think, you know, yeah, so I'd be interested in just what you all have to say about just the value of transimperial versus inter-imperial. Do you have a strong investment in one or the other?
Okay, yeah, maybe it's now my turn. Yeah, I would really go for trans instead of inter, as I think inter, also in terms of the act, when we look at the historical actors, I think there is an advantage if we look at this sort of in-between actors. And I don't think we only have to look at those that perceive themselves as whatever cosmopolitan experts and much more, but also those that perhaps move not so voluntarily and are not kind of agents of empire, but just in between various empires. And this opens up to, I think, new empire stories and histories than when we sort of look from one empire to the other and this interconnection. So I would say methodologically it's a difference for me personally, and it makes a difference what we look at in that sense. And inter really is for me this interstate sort of agency project, which is very important, but still trans then goes in a way beyond that and includes actors and voices that we otherwise would perhaps not, just would not pop up or would not be part of the picture. And also I think then what I wanted to make sort of a point of is that the trans also offers us this sort of, to look more into material aspects. So how are things connected through oceans, the air, and much more, and also what has been labeled ecological imperialism, right? So when species, human or non-human species, move in between empires, what does this mean? And how does the environment as sort of an agent or actor plays into all this? And then certainly I think it's worth not talking about inter-imperial history, but rather use the term trans-imperial history.
I'd just like to add something, but it's more about your question about empire. I would give you the answer that I give to my students. If you...
I'm a student now.
Yes, that's why you said you were. So I would say that if you use empire in the if you use a constructivist approach, you're going to see how the different actors are defining empire themselves, and this is important. If you have a normal approach, let's say a realistic approach, then you have to define empire, whether you define by what it does or by who it is, and whatever the definition you take, because you can find as many scholars, many definitions of empire, maybe. I mean, not really, no, but you have definition. What an empire is, it a territorial colonial history? Is it only economic influence? You have to define very clearly at the beginning what you mean by empire. Afterwards, that's, I met, if my students are writing an essay and they use the concept of empire all along and they never define it, they don't pass, as simple as that.
This is...
That's it. There's no discussion about it, except if they have a constructivist approach and they see how different actors use empire in different contexts. That's different.
But historians often don't define.
Yes.
Yeah. Political scientists, sociologists tend to. And we just use these terms and say, let's see where it goes.
Well, I'm a political scientist, that's why maybe I'm so strict.
So as the chair, I declare that we may go 10 minutes over time. This is my prerogative. So let's start with Heidi. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, actually, my original question, Nadine actually answered quite well, which is good because I didn't know how to formulate the question. But I was thinking about what your map of oceans and the sense of verticality does to chronology, and also what it does to centering empire as a state project, or decentering empire as a state project, rather. And I wonder if, I was thinking about, it made me think of Bathsheba DeMuth's recent History of the Bering Straits, where the state doesn't really exist much at all. It's really about resource extraction. And I wonder if you think in your project, if part of what has to happen is the decentering of empire, that empire becomes part of a longer history rather than the center of it.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, that's a very important question. Yeah, I mean, Bathsheba's work, I don't know whether you know it, is precisely what I also have in mind when I'm articulating these things. So she actually wrote about sort of the clash over resources in between the Russian Empire, you could say, and the American Empire and some other empires. And what she sort of showed that these imperialists are just part of a much broader picture that also has not simply genealogies, but also kind of different chronologies. If you look at environment and also non-human actors as a force of historical transformation. So I think in that sense, one can decenter empire studies on multiple levels, in a way. Decenter it to sort of move away from the model of British Empire, first of all, but also then move away from just the set of actors we usually have in mind when it comes to empire studies.
And we have Christoph and Lolly. Christoph is sitting right here.
Yes, I'm Christoph de Jong from the University of Bern, and my question also goes to Nadine. I very much liked your idea to challenge Charles Mayer's concept of territoriality by looking at this vertical space of the ocean. So I like the idea, but I'm not entirely convinced. Because, I mean, in the 1970s, you also have this global environmental movement. You have Greenpeace, which were particularly challenging or critiquing Japan for the whaling. I mean, you have also the Club of Rome. I mean, in your papers, scientists, they were more agents of empire or nation states, but you could also, with the Club of Rome or to the climate scientists, you could also have scientists that are part of a global environmental movement or speakers for global environmental movement or consciousness. So and this obviously ties into to Paul's remark that empires also, or there might also be global processes in which empires or nation states have to tie in or react to. So I'm wondering, what would you say to this, or how would these processes fit into your narrative?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that perfectly fits into the narrative because there are different levels. I mean, one level is sort of what I named then the paradigms, right? So we have these shifting paradigms of global conditionalities and hierarchization of knowledge. And certainly in the 1950s, you have the Club of Rome, and then in the 70s, let's say, an international move into environmental movements. But this differs from what you would see on a material level, namely the territorialization of the ocean. And that's sort of, in a way, a matrix even, right? So you have this global discourse, and in a way, you have also then regionalized projects. But at the end of the day, then, it's also very much going back to a nation-state landscape when you look at sovereignty issues and the territory that is occupied by nation-state, but it's not globalized. So you don't have an increasing space that would be named some sort of whatever, global outer space or something like that. So there's a huge difference in between the discursive level of internationalism and globalism, and at the same time, re-territorialization, which sort of moves back to the nation state. And so that's the level where I would say I would disagree with Charles Mayer.
Lale.
Lale Can, City University of New York. I just had a follow-up to one of the comments. I think it was Ulrike's comment, which was a question to Paul about terminology and the shift from inter-imperial to international. And I think that in raising that question, you made there was something undergirding that there was a shift from earlier histories of cooperation. And so for me, the question was then again, which empires are we talking about? Mm-hmm. Because in the long 19th century, I see a lot of coercion when you're looking at lots of inter-imperial or transimperial types of connections. And then also empires that we don't necessarily study the relations between like the Qing and the Qajars and the Ottomans, where there's really no study of those kinds of relationships and not necessarily cooperation there either. So maybe just a question, it's more of a comment to flag for us, because a lot of us working in our area studies fields are engaging with different kinds of questions. And so for me, like the idea of cooperation among states brings like a concert of Europe type of idea, which is very lacking in the histories that I study. So it was just a follow-up to that comment. Thank you. So.
Thank you so much. Let me abuse my prerogative again and just use 1 minute to draw together a few things, okay? You just brought in another C, coercion. There are lots of C's around, so, you know, we could add this to the list. trans versus inter-imperial. In the field of diplomatic history, I think particularly in US diplomatic history, I think in the last 10 years, a lot of people have been trying to really bring them together and basically showing that it does make a lot of sense to make them apart and that there is a history to actually keeping them apart, which has a lot to do with state interest. So Erez Manela, talks about international society as a concept that brings the two together. So perhaps, and I don't know whether this works, but perhaps one could sort of, think along these lines too, to just rethink whether we actually need to make a choice. I mean, we need perhaps, but just to think with other models. Class, I think, was all over the place, but we didn't name it. And I think that's something, might be really interesting to sort of look at, right? There is a, Europe-wide, sort of some level, upper aristocratic class in the 19th century. How does this play out inter-imperially abroad? And there are some people who do really interesting work on this, right? Versus the, let's say, lower class, right? And last but not least, very quickly, the nation and the empire. I found this a really interesting bit that also was reflected in a lot of what we were doing, right? You pointed it out, Véronique, but also others, how certain things had happened between particular building sort of, nation states, even as early as the 18th century, who also have an internal empire project, of course, right? Then, become played up inter-imperially on a broader sort of global stage. So I think that's something we really need to, continue paying attention to, not to try to yank the national, whatever that may mean, out of our story. I think that's I hear a lot of people sort of, that explicit or implicitly talking about this. So, thank you so much for a great first panel. Thank you so much for all the questions, and let's eat.